In the closing years of the 11th century, the world of Europe and the Near East was changing in profound ways. Kingdoms and empires stretched across both continents, tied together not only by trade, but also by deep religious divisions. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism each claimed holy places within the ancient land of Palestine. For centuries, Jerusalem had been at the center of devotion, conflict, and pilgrimage. Whoever held it wielded both political and spiritual power. By the end of the 11th century, that city and the lands around it were controlled by Muslim rulers, while Christian pilgrims journeyed there from across Europe, often enduring hardship and danger along the way. This was the setting into which the story of the Knights Templar would later unfold. Europe at this time was a feudal world. Power was divided among countless lords, knights, and monarchs who ruled their lands not through strong central governments, but through webs of allegiance. A peasant pledged service to his local lord, who in turn pledged loyalty to a greater, noble, and finally to a king. This system provided order, but it also made Europe fragmented, with rivalries often breaking into open conflict. Despite this constant turbulence, faith bound people together. The Christian Church, with the Pope at its head, was the one institution that crossed borders and unified the minds of men and women in nearly every corner of Western Europe. At the same time, the Islamic world stretched from Spain in the west to Persia in the east. In many regions, Islamic rulers fostered prosperous cities, vibrant culture, and centers of learning that far surpassed much of Europe. Great libraries, skilled artisans, and bustling markets filled cities such as Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. Within these societies, Christian and Jewish communities often lived as minorities, subject to taxes and special rules, but still able to practice their faiths. Jerusalem itself had been under Muslim rule for centuries, and while Christian pilgrims were usually permitted to visit, the journey to the city was long, costly, and filled with dangers. Pilgrimage was a central part of medieval devotion. To walk the road to a holy shrine was not simply a journey of curiosity, but an act of penance, a way to seek forgiveness of sins or divine blessing. Pilgrims from Europe traveled to holy sites in Rome, Santiago de Compostela, and most of all, to Jerusalem, the city where Christ was crucified and resurrected. Reaching Jerusalem was the dream of many, but the path was perilous. Bandits roamed the roads, pirates preyed on travelers crossing seas, and disease or hunger could strike at any time. Few who set out for the Holy Land did so without fear. Political situation added to the uncertainty. The Seljuk Turks, a powerful Muslim dynasty, had expanded into the Middle East, defeating Byzantine forces and threatening the Christian Empire of Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, desperate for aid, turned to the West for help. This appeal would spark one of the most dramatic movements of the medieval world, the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II answered this call. At the Council of Clermont in France, he delivered a sermon that would resound across Christendom. He urged knights and nobles to take up the cross, to march to the east, and to free Jerusalem from Muslim rule. His words promised not only spiritual rewards, such as forgiveness of sins, but also honor and eternal glory. The call spread quickly, inspiring both seasoned warriors and common peasants to leave their homes and set out on the long march to the Holy Land. What followed was the First Crusade. The First Crusade was unlike anything Europe had seen before. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children answered the call. Some were motivated by genuine piety, others by a hope for adventure, land, or wealth. The journey was brutal. Many perished from hunger and disease before they ever reached the walls of Jerusalem. Yet against all odds, in 1099, the Crusaders captured the city after a bloody siege. For the first time in centuries, Jerusalem was in Christian hands. The Crusaders established states across the conquered territories, such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch. These fragile realms were held by European nobles, surrounded by hostile powers and dependent on reinforcements and supplies from the West. Despite their victories, the Crusader states faced constant threats. Muslim forces regrouped and launched counterattacks, and the local terrain was unfamiliar and harsh for European settlers. Pilgrims continued to stream into the Holy Land, but they were exposed to even greater danger now, traveling across contested lands filled with raids and ambushes. Many were robbed, enslaved, or killed before reaching their destination. The Crusader rulers lacked the manpower to guard every road or protect every traveler. It was in this climate of tension and insecurity that the idea of a dedicated brotherhood of warrior monks began to take shape. Knights who took holy vows, not only to defend their lord or their land, but to defend pilgrims and the faith itself, filled a pressing need. The Church, eager to maintain its influence in the East and sustain the fragile Crusader states, welcomed such ideas. In the years after the First Crusade, as pilgrims continued to arrive and as the Crusader kingdoms struggled for survival, men would come together to form what became one of the most famous orders in medieval history. The Knights Templar did not yet exist in these early years, but the world was already preparing the ground for them. Europe was a land of restless warriors seeking purpose. The Holy Land was a place of both devotion and danger, and the Crusades had opened a new stage for faith and conflict. Into this world, a small band of knights would soon step forward, dedicating themselves to protecting travelers and defending Christendom. From humble beginnings, they would grow into a force that shaped the destiny of both East and West, remembered in equal measure for their faith, their power, and the legends that surround them. The year was 1119, 2 decades after the capture of Jerusalem by the First Crusade. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had been founded, but it remained fragile and surrounded by enemies. Within the walls of the Holy City, European rulers held power, yet just beyond the city gates lay danger. Caravans and groups of pilgrims continued to arrive from the West, driven by devotion and the hope of setting eyes on the sites of Christ's passion and resurrection. Their journey, however, was treacherous. The roads were long, the hills difficult, and robbers or raiders were never far away. Many who survived the journey across Europe and the sea still found themselves vulnerable in the land they had come so far to see. It was in this tense world that a small group of knights chose a different path. Led by Hugues de Payens, a French nobleman from the region of Champagne, 9 men pledged themselves to a new kind of service. They were knights, trained in war and raised in the traditions of feudal Europe, yet they now sought to devote their swords not to a king or a lord, but to God and to the protection of pilgrims. Their purpose was simple and direct: to safeguard the roads that led to Jerusalem, ensuring that the faithful could reach the holy places without fear of robbery or slaughter. In the beginning, their numbers were so small that their efforts seemed almost symbolic. 9 men could not patrol every road or guard every caravan, but their commitment carried great weight. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, just as monks did. Unlike monks, however, they carried swords and lances, rode horses and wore armor. They combined the discipline of the cloister with the courage of the battlefield, creating something new in the medieval world. They were to live as both monks and warriors, servants of God, who would defend rather than retreat from the dangers of the world. The early years were marked by hardship. With no great wealth to support them, the brothers relied on donations of food and supplies from sympathetic nobles and from the King of Jerusalem, Baldwin II. Their clothing was plain and their possessions few. They followed a strict life of prayer, fasting, and duty, spending long hours in devotion before marching out to protect travelers. Contemporary accounts tell us that their appearance was humble, with simple garments and modest arms, yet their reputation for courage grew quickly. Pilgrims, who once trembled at the thought of crossing lawless stretches of road, now found hope in the sight of these mounted guardians. The location of their headquarters gave the new brotherhood a powerful symbol. King Baldwin granted them quarters within a wing of the royal palace that stood on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This site was revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. It was believed to be the place where Solomon's temple had once stood, the ancient house of God that had long ago been destroyed but never forgotten. By lodging in this sacred area, the knights were associated in the minds of the faithful with the wisdom and glory of Solomon's reign. From this, they came to be known as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. In time, the shorter name would endure, the Knights Templar. The connection to Solomon's temple did more than provide a name. It wrapped the new order in an aura of holiness and mystery, to guard pilgrims while dwelling on ground that carried the memory of biblical kings, made their mission feel ordained by God. It reminded contemporaries that the order was more than a band of soldiers. It was a spiritual brotherhood that linked the chivalry of Europe to the sacred history of Jerusalem itself. Despite the sacred symbolism, the Templars remained small and vulnerable in their first years. They were not yet recognized officially by the wider church, and without papal approval, their future was uncertain. Many nobles admired their bravery, but others doubted whether a group of armed monks could survive or whether they might become dangerous. In these early days, the Templars were a curious experiment, born out of the particular needs of the Crusader states. Yet the simplicity of their mission carried power. In a world where many knights fought for wealth, for land, or for personal glory, the Templars stood apart. They had no estates of their own, no treasures to hoard, and no wives or children to provide heirs. Their only task was to guard pilgrims and to give their lives, if necessary, in defense of the holy places. This clarity of purpose inspired admiration, and slowly their reputation began to spread. The brotherhood endured by relying on devotion, discipline, and the generosity of supporters. Each knight was bound to his companions as a brother, sharing hardship as well as triumph. Their numbers grew only slowly at first, but each new recruit strengthened the order's resolve. They trained together, prayed together, and rode out together, building a sense of unity that made them stronger than their small numbers suggested. The early years of the Templars may seem modest when compared with the grandeur they would later achieve, but they reveal the foundation of their power. They began not as wealthy lords or mighty armies, but as humble knights with a holy mission. Their base on the Temple Mount tied them to biblical history. Their vows set them apart from other warriors, and their devotion gave them strength. Ufene, a land of uncertainty and danger, they offered protection and hope. It was from these small beginnings, in the shadow of the ancient Temple of Solomon, that the Knights Templar first took shape. The Knights Templar began as a small band of warriors with a holy mission, but their survival and future growth depended on recognition from both kings and the church. Without authority, their vows and their purpose might wither away, dismissed as a temporary experiment in the turbulent world of the Crusader states. What transformed them from a modest brotherhood into one of the most powerful institutions of the Middle Ages was a combination of royal favor, papal support, and the careful shaping of their image as both monks and knights. Their earliest patron was King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Baldwin, like many rulers of the Crusader states, faced immense challenges. His kingdom was under constant threat from Muslim neighbors, resources were scarce, and pilgrims continued to flow into Jerusalem with little protection. Baldwin saw in the small order of knights a potential ally. Though their numbers were few, their commitment was unwavering. He granted them lodging on the Temple Mount, linking their mission to the most sacred site in the city. By doing so, he gave them not only a base, but also a powerful symbol. The support of Baldwin II provided legitimacy, yet it was only the beginning. To grow and to endure, the Templars needed recognition from the wider Christian world. That recognition came in 1129 at the Council of Troyes in France. This council was a gathering of churchmen, nobles, and influential leaders who met to examine the nature of the new order. At its heart was a question that had never been asked before. Could a knight, sworn to violence and trained in the art of war, also live as a monk devoted to God? Could one hold the sword and the cross together without falling into contradiction? The answer was given with the help of one of the most respected figures of the age, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was a leading voice in the Cistercian reform movement, a man known for his piety, eloquence, and influence within the church. At the Council of Troyes, he rose to defend the Templars, praising them as warriors of Christ who fought not for personal glory, but for the safety of pilgrims and the defense of the Holy City. He contrasted their discipline with that of worldly knights who sought riches and honor. The Templars, he declared, fought a spiritual war, and their battles were a form of service to God. His words gave moral and theological foundation to the Brotherhood. The council formally approved the order, giving them the right to exist within the structure of the church. Out of this came the Templar rule, a code of life that shaped every aspect of their existence. The rule required vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, binding the knights as firmly as any monk in a cloister. Yet the Templar rule also included their unique military duty. Unlike monks who withdrew from the world, the Templars were commanded to face its dangers. They were forbidden to flee in battle unless overwhelmingly outnumbered, and they were expected to fight with courage even in the face of certain death. Their daily lives were ordered by prayer, silence at meals, modest clothing, and the rejection of luxury. Horses and weapons were allowed, but they were considered tools for service, not possessions for pride. This balance between monastic devotion and military responsibility was revolutionary. It gave knights across Europe a new vision of holiness. A man of noble birth, trained for war, no longer had to abandon his sword to serve God. By joining the Templars, he could channel his skills into a holy purpose. This combination of the spiritual and the martial helped the order grow, as knights saw in it both discipline and honor. The Council of Troyes not only confirmed the order, but also set it on the path to expansion. With papal approval, the Templars gained privileges that freed them from local interference. They answered directly to the Pope, bypassing bishops and kings. This independence would later make them both powerful and controversial, but in the early years it gave them freedom to expand across Christendom. One of the most visible signs of their recognition was the granting of their distinctive dress. At first, their clothing had been plain and humble, reflecting their vow of poverty. But in time, the Pope allowed them to wear the white mantle, a symbol of purity. On this mantle was added a red cross, a mark that came to define their identity. The white reminded all of their devotion, while the red symbolized both martyrdom and their readiness to shed blood in battle for the faith. To see a knight clad in the white mantle with the cross was to see a man who had renounced worldly glory for divine service. The sight of this garment carried power. Pilgrims on the road could recognize their guardians. Enemies in battle could distinguish their determination. Fellow Christians in Europe could admire their discipline. The mantle was not merely clothing, but a declaration of purpose, one that set them apart from every other warrior of the age. With papal blessing, a sacred rule, and a powerful symbol, the Templars grew from a handful of men into an order that spread across Europe. Donations of land, money, and resources began to flow in. Noble families eager to support the defense of Jerusalem granted estates to the order. Knights seeking a holy vocation joined their ranks. The Brotherhood was no longer a fragile experiment, but an institution firmly rooted in the heart of Christendom. This stage of their history was crucial. Without Baldwin's patronage, they might have remained a small band confined to Jerusalem. Without the Council of Troyes and Bernard's defense, they might have been condemned as misguided warriors. Without the rule and the white mantle, they might have lacked identity and cohesion. Instead, each of these elements combined to give them strength. The Templars now stood as a recognized order of the Church, guardians of pilgrims, warriors of Christ, and symbols of holy devotion. Their future growth, wealth, and influence all stemmed from this foundation. With the approval of the Church and the blessing of kings, the Knights Templar quickly grew from a small band of guardians into a recognized military order. Their mission placed them at the very heart of the Crusader states. These fragile kingdoms, carved out of the Holy Land after the First Crusade, were surrounded by powerful Muslim neighbors and constantly threatened by raids, sieges, and open war. The survival of these Christian outposts depended on strong defenses and disciplined warriors, and the Templars soon became essential to their defense. The Templars did not act as rulers in the Holy Land. Their role was not to govern towns or administer law, but to fight and to protect. They manned castles, escorted pilgrims, and rode out with the armies of the Crusader kings. What distinguished them was their dedication. Unlike many knights who served only for a season, or who returned home once their vows of crusade were complete, the Templars were permanent defenders. They lived in the East year after year, trained together, and followed the strict rule of their order. Their constancy gave them a reputation for reliability at a time when shifting loyalties and broken promises often weakened the Crusader states. One of the earliest battles that displayed their courage came at the siege of Ascalon in 1153. Ascalon was a strategic port city on the coast of the Levant, held by Egyptian forces. For years, it had served as a base for raids against the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Capturing it would secure the southern frontier of the Crusader kingdom. During the long and difficult siege, the Templars played a leading role. Their discipline in maintaining the siege lines and their bravery in repeated assaults helped bring the city to surrender. With Ascalon in Christian hands, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was safer and the reputation of the Templars grew stronger. Another moment of glory came at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177. At this time, the famous Muslim leader, Saladin, had gathered a powerful army and marched against the Crusaders. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, though afflicted with leprosy and commanding only a small force, rode out to meet him. With him were the Templars. Against overwhelming odds, the Christian army engaged Saladin near Montgisard. The Templars, renowned for their ferocity in the charge, fought at the center of the battle. Their attack, combined with the determination of Baldwin's men, shattered Saladin's much larger army. The victory was stunning, and it reinforced the image of the Templars as warriors who would not falter even when outnumbered. For a brief time, their success gave hope to the Crusader states that survival was still possible. Yet the Templars were not only men of open battle. Much of their importance lay in their defense of castles and fortresses across the Holy Land. These strongholds were vital for holding territory and for protecting roads used by pilgrims and merchants. The Templars held some of the most famous castles in the East, including Safed, Tortosa, and Gaza. Within these walls, they maintained strict routines of watchfulness, ensuring that garrisons were always prepared for attack. When sieges came, the Templars were known for their stubborn resistance. Chroniclers often praised them for defending castles until the last man, refusing to surrender even when hope seemed lost. Their endurance made them a cornerstone of the Crusader military system. The discipline of the Templars in battle was legendary. Their rule forbade them to flee unless heavily outnumbered, and even then retreat was seen as shameful. When charging into combat, they rode in tight formation, trained to strike as a single body rather than as scattered individuals. This unity made their charges far more effective than those of ordinary knights. In an age when knights often sought personal glory by charging ahead or dueling rivals, the Templars stood apart. Their loyalty was to the order, not to their own fame. This made them not only more reliable, but also more terrifying to their enemies. Their bravery was rooted not only in training, but in faith. The Templars saw themselves as warriors of God, fighting not for plunder or reward, but for a spiritual cause. To die in battle was not considered defeat, but a form of martyrdom, a passage into eternal reward. This conviction gave them an unshakable resolve that even their opponents recognized. Muslim chroniclers, though hostile, often acknowledged the courage and determination of the Templars. To face them on the battlefield was to face men who feared neither death nor defeat. The Templars were not the only military order active in the Holy Land. The Hospitallers, originally founded to care for sick pilgrims, had also taken up arms and became skilled defenders of castles and participants in battles. Later, the Teutonic Knights, formed from German Crusaders, added another order to the scene. Each had its own rule and traditions, but comparisons were inevitable. The Hospitallers were admired for their generosity and care for the sick, though they matched the Templars in martial ability. The Teutonic Knights became important in later Crusades, particularly in Eastern Europe. Yet among these orders, the Templars held a special prominence. Their name tied to the Temple of Solomon, and their early role in defending pilgrims gave them a prestige that set them apart. The combination of discipline, courage, and faith turned the Templars into symbols of Christian strength in the Holy Land. Their victories at Ascalon and Montgisard, their unyielding defense of fortresses, and their reputation for unity in battle marked them as unmatched warriors. To pilgrims, they were guardians. To kings, they were dependable allies. To enemies, they were formidable foes. In the Crusader states, where survival often hung by a thread, the Templars were seen as a shield of Christendom. Their rise as warriors of God was not merely a story of blood and steel, but of devotion and identity. The white mantle, with its red cross, the vow of service and the willingness to die for their faith, created a powerful image that endured long after battles were lost and castles fell. The Templars were never the largest army, nor the richest order in these early years, but they became the most recognizable. Their reputation for bravery in the defense of the Holy Land ensured that they would remain central to both history and legend. The Crusader states, fragile by nature and surrounded by powerful enemies, could not have survived without fortresses. For the Knights Templar, castles were more than military strongholds. They were symbols of faith, guardians of trade routes, and centers of daily life. Rising out of rocky hills or standing watch over vital roads, these stone giants embodied the Order's mission. To walk within their walls was to step into a world where devotion met discipline and where the architecture of stone became as important as sword and shield. Among the most famous of these fortresses was Crac des Chevaliers in present-day Syria. Although it was originally built and expanded by the Hospitallers, Crac exemplifies the type of fortress that became the lifeblood of all the military orders, including the Templars. Standing on a hilltop, Crac was a marvel of medieval military architecture. Its walls rose in concentric layers, each line of defense reinforcing the next. Towers projected outward, giving defenders the ability to cover every angle with arrows and stones. Deep moats and steep slopes made assaults costly and dangerous. A besieger would have to face not one wall but many, each harder to conquer than the last. The Templars built and manned similar castles, learning from these innovations and improving upon them over time. Safed, a castle held by the Templars in Galilee, was another example of their mastery. Perched high in the mountains, it commanded views across the surrounding landscape. Any army moving through the region would be spotted long before it arrived. Its walls were massive, built from thick stone that resisted siege engines. Within the fortress, courtyards, chapels, and living quarters created a small community. Safed was not simply a military post, but a miniature city of faith and order, where knights, sergeants, priests, and servants lived together. Its fall to Muslim forces in the 13th century was remembered as one of the great losses of the Crusader states, showing just how vital these castles were. Tortosa, a coastal fortress in modern-day Syria, held special importance for the Templars. Located on the Mediterranean, it guarded vital trade routes and served as a naval base. Its towers faced the sea, while its walls looked inland across contested territory. Tortosa became a hub of activity, with ships bringing supplies from Europe and knights riding out to patrol the countryside. The blending of sea and land made it a unique stronghold, and its endurance long after many other fortresses had fallen showed the resilience of the Order's architectural designs. These castles were not only military outposts, they were innovations in architecture that influenced fortification design across Europe. Builders used massive curtain walls, rounded towers to deflect missiles, and carefully designed gates that acted as deadly traps for attackers. Arrow slits allowed defenders to rain down fire while remaining protected. In some castles, underground cisterns ensured a steady water supply during long sieges. Storage chambers held grain and salted meat to sustain the garrison for months. The goal was not merely to resist an attack, but to outlast it, turning every siege into a costly ordeal for the enemy. The spiritual side of these castles was equally important. Each fortress contained a chapel where the brothers gathered for prayer. Daily worship ordered the rhythm of life, reminding the knights that they fought not only as soldiers, but as servants of God. The sound of chanting voices within the stone walls gave the garrisons a sense of purpose that went beyond survival. For the Templars, every castle was a monastery as well as a fortress. It was a place of silence, devotion, and discipline. Life inside a Templar castle was strict but orderly. At dawn, the day began with prayer in the chapel. Meals were simple and eaten in silence, accompanied by readings from scripture. Each knight followed the rule, which demanded humility and obedience. Armor and weapons were maintained with care, horses tended daily, and patrols sent out to watch the roads. Training was constant, for the knights knew that an attack could come at any moment. Archery practice, riding drills, and mock battles kept the garrison prepared. Not all who lived within the walls were knights. Sergeants, lower-ranking warriors, shared in the defense. Priests tended to the spiritual needs of the brothers. Servants, artisans, and farmers maintained the supplies. Together, they formed a small but complete society. The order of life inside mirrored the Order's ideals. Pride and excess were discouraged, while unity and obedience were praised. To live in a Templar castle was to live in a disciplined rhythm of prayer, labor, and vigilance. To outsiders, these castles appeared almost invincible, yet they were also havens of safety. Pilgrims traveling through the Holy Land could find refuge. Within their walls, merchants carrying goods along dangerous routes often relied on the presence of nearby fortresses. To see the white mantle of the Templar on a castle's battlements was to know that protection and discipline stood watch. The castles also served as symbols to friend and foe alike. To Christians, they were reminders that the Holy Land was guarded by warriors of faith. To Muslim armies, they were obstacles that demanded immense effort to overcome. Each fortress that stood defiant extended the life of the Crusader states. Each fortress that fell marked a step in their decline. For the Templars themselves, these fortresses were more than stone walls. They were embodiments of their vow. Within their gates, they combined the roles of monk and knight, living in prayer while preparing for war. Every tower and chapel, every gate and courtyard reflected the dual nature of the order. Faith and discipline, prayer and battle, all were joined together in these castles of stone and devotion. The Templar castles remain among the most enduring legacies of the order. Many lie in ruins today, yet their outlines still rise against the horizon, silent witnesses to an age when faith and war were bound together. They remind us that the Templars were not only warriors of God, but also builders, guardians, and monks of stone. In these strongholds, the Brotherhood carved its identity into the very landscape of the Holy Land, leaving behind fortresses that were as much symbols of faith as they were instruments of war. When the Knights Templar were first founded, they called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. Their earliest members owned little, and their clothing was plain. They relied on gifts of food and shelter, and their small band was marked more by faith than by fortune. Yet within a century, this image of poverty no longer matched the reality of their position. The order grew into one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in all of medieval Christendom. They were still monks, bound by vows of poverty as individuals, but as a brotherhood, they commanded lands, castles, and financial networks that stretched across Europe and the Middle East. The paradox of poor knights who commanded vast riches became one of the defining features of the order's history. The foundation of their wealth was the generosity of donors. From the moment they gained papal recognition, nobles across Europe were eager to support the Templars. To give land or money to the order was considered an act of piety, ensuring prayers for one's soul and contributing to the defense of the Holy Land. Kings, counts, and lesser lords donated estates, villages, and even entire regions to the Templars. Over time, these gifts created a patchwork of possessions spread across France, England, Spain, Portugal, Germany, and beyond. A knight who could not personally travel to Jerusalem might still feel part of the crusading effort by granting land to the Templars. Knowing that the revenues would support warriors in the East, the order did not allow these donations to lie idle. With the discipline that marked every aspect of their life, the Templars developed their holdings into a carefully managed network of wealth. Farms produced grain and livestock. Vineyards supplied wine not only for local use, but also for export. Mills ground flour, and markets collected tolls. Each estate was overseen with strict records, ensuring that income flowed steadily to the order's central treasuries. What set the Templars apart from many other lords was their efficiency. They were less interested in luxury than in stability and control, and this made their properties unusually productive. Templar commanderies, as these estates were called, became the backbone of the order's power in Europe. A commandery might include farmland, pastures, barns, workshops, and a chapel. Brothers stationed there followed the same rule as those in the Holy Land, living simply and dedicating themselves to both labor and prayer. The revenues they produced were collected and eventually transferred to support the war effort in the East. This network of estates created a steady flow of resources that allowed the Templars to sustain armies and maintain castles far from the fields that funded them. There, wealth was not only in land, but also in money. As pilgrims streamed toward the Holy Land, the Templars discovered a way to serve them, while also expanding their financial influence. A pilgrim setting out from Europe might deposit money or valuables at a Templar house before beginning the long journey. In return, he would receive a written document, a kind of letter of credit. On arrival in the East, the pilgrim could present this document to a Templar house and receive funds in local currency. This system meant that travelers no longer had to carry large sums of gold or silver across dangerous roads filled with bandits. The Order's reputation for honesty and security made them trusted bankers for pilgrims, kings, and nobles alike. In effect, the Templars created one of the earliest international banking systems. Their network of houses allowed wealth to move across continents without the physical transport of coin. They safeguarded deposits, transferred funds, and even offered loans to rulers who needed money for war. Their knowledge of account-keeping and their wide connections made them indispensable to both pilgrims and princes. The Order's treasury in Paris became one of the safest and most trusted vaults in Europe. At the same time, their farms and estates across Europe provided the steady resources that underpinned their financial operations. Grain grown in the fields of France might feed pilgrims in the east. Sheep raised on English estates provided wool for trade. Vineyards in Spain produced wine for both local communities and for export across the Mediterranean. The Templars built networks of supply that stretched from rural villages to bustling ports. Ships carried goods under their protection, linking distant parts of Christendom. The Order's financial role did not mean they abandoned their vows of poverty. Each individual Templar owned nothing personally. Their clothing, armor, and weapons were provided by the Order. Luxuries were forbidden, and their meals remained simple. Yet collectively, the Order became immensely wealthy, and this wealth gave them power and influence. Monarchs borrowed from them, nobles trusted them with deposits, and pilgrims relied on their services. This unusual mixture of poverty and wealth puzzled contemporaries and eventually fed suspicion about their motives. Still, in the 12th and 13th centuries, their wealth was seen largely as a blessing. Without it, the Crusader states could not have been supported. Without their estates in Europe, their castles in the East could not have been maintained. The Templars had managed to turn donations into a carefully balanced system that linked faith, war, and economy together. They became warriors of God, who also mastered the skills of merchants and bankers. Their vineyards, farms, and financial houses gave them influence across continents. But these were always tied back to their central mission. The money they handled, the land they worked, and the goods they shipped were meant to sustain the defense of the Holy Land. The Order's identity as soldiers and monks remained intact, even as their reputation for wealth grew. The rise of the Templars as bankers of Christendom reflected both their discipline and their reach. Few institutions in medieval Europe could match their network. Their castles stood as symbols of military strength, but their estates and treasuries revealed another kind of fortress, one built not of stone, but of wealth and trust. This combination would make them indispensable in their age, and also dangerously vulnerable when envy and suspicion arose. For the moment, however, their wealth was seen as proof of God's favor, a sign that their holy mission was prospering both in spirit and in the material world. The Knights Templar were not only warriors and bankers. Over the centuries, they became surrounded by an aura of mystery, woven from stories of relics, secret rituals, and hidden treasures. To many of their contemporaries, the Templars were a brotherhood that stood apart from ordinary knights. To later generations, they became figures of legend, guardians of holy relics, and keepers of secrets that stretched beyond history into myth. Their image as monks in armor, bound to silence and discipline, created fertile ground for tales that grew ever more elaborate with the passing of time. One of the most enduring associations of the Templars was with relics of the Christian faith. Among the most sacred objects of the medieval world was the true cross, believed to be the very cross on which Christ was crucified. Fragments of it were carried into battle by Crusader kings, and chroniclers sometimes suggested that the Templars had a role in guarding such holy treasures. When the Crusader states suffered defeat, stories arose that the loss of the true cross doomed their cause. Whether or not the Templars ever truly possessed such relics, their close connection to the defense of the Holy Land made them natural candidates in the popular imagination for their guardianship. Legends also link the Templars to the Ark of the Covenant, the ancient chest that once held the tablets of the law given to Moses. The Ark had been lost for centuries, yet its mystery lingered in Christian and Jewish tradition. Because the Templars were headquartered on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in a building believed to stand upon the ruins of Solomon's Temple, whispers arose that they had uncovered ancient secrets buried beneath its stones. To those who loved tales of hidden treasure, it was easy to imagine the knights unearthing the Ark or other relics from the biblical past, keeping them hidden from the world. Perhaps the most famous myth of all is the Templars' supposed link to the Holy Grail. In medieval legend, the Grail was often imagined as the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, or the vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion. It became a central symbol in romances and poems, particularly in the stories of King Arthur and his knights. Some writers began to weave the Templars into these legends, casting them as the secret guardians of the Grail. The image of a disciplined brotherhood of warrior monks charged with protecting the most sacred object of Christianity was powerful, and it endured in the imagination of later centuries. Part of what fueled these associations was the secrecy of the order itself. The Templars lived by a rule that demanded obedience and silence. Their ceremonies were not open to outsiders, and their inner life was largely hidden from the public. This natural secrecy, combined with their immense power and wealth, gave rise to suspicion. When people cannot see what lies behind closed doors, they often fill the silence with stories. For the Templars, those stories became myths of strange rituals, hidden knowledge, and mystical powers. Accusations during their trials in the 14th century fed these legends further. Under torture, some members confessed to denying Christ, spitting on the cross, or engaging in bizarre ceremonies. While historians now view these confessions as products of pain and coercion, they left behind an impression that the order had guarded strange and dangerous secrets. The image of Templars as keepers of forbidden rites became part of their legend, woven into the fabric of European imagination. Over the centuries, chroniclers and storytellers built upon these suspicions. In the Middle Ages, poetry and romance gave them a role in tales of the Grail and hidden treasure. In later centuries, secret societies like the Freemasons were sometimes said to be heirs of the Templars, inheriting their knowledge and their mysteries. The French Revolution, the Enlightenment, and the rise of modern secret orders all revived interest in the Templars as symbols of hidden wisdom and resistance to authority. Each age reshaped the Templars according to its own concerns, turning them into symbols of whatever mysteries people wished to explore. In modern fiction, the Templars have remained ever-present. Novels, films, and popular histories often portray them as keepers of great secrets, from the Grail to lost treasures, hidden beneath cathedrals. Their name alone is enough to evoke images of shadowy rituals, buried riches, and maps leading to forgotten chambers. While historians strive to uncover the truth of their daily lives, popular culture continues to surround them with mystery. What is striking is how much of this mythic image rests upon kernels of truth. The Templars really were guardians of sacred sites in Jerusalem. They really did live lives of secrecy, closed to outsiders. They really did gather great wealth and manage it with a discipline that looked strange to their contemporaries. Out of these realities, imagination built castles of legend as grand as any fortress the Templars constructed in stone. For the people of the Middle Ages, the Templars embodied both reassurance and fear. To supporters, they were protectors of faith, perhaps even guardians of relics too holy for ordinary men to see. To detractors, they were suspicious figures, cloaked in secrecy and power, perhaps even dabbling in forbidden practices. In later centuries, this dual image of holiness and hidden knowledge became the foundation of their enduring place in myth. The truth of what relics the Templars possessed may never be fully known. Some treasures, like fragments of the True Cross, were recorded as being carried into battle, but many of the wilder claims belong more to legend than to history. What can be said with certainty is that the Templars inspired stories that outlasted their own age. Long after their suppression, their name lived on, bound forever to tales of the Grail, the Ark, and hidden treasure. Thus, the Templars became more than a military order. They became symbols of mystery, woven into the imagination of Europe. The line between fact and legend blurred until the knights themselves seemed larger than life. Whether guarding relics of Christ or secrets of Solomon's temple, whether chanting prayers in hidden chambers or riding out with the Grail itself, the Templars became figures of eternal fascination. Their myths, as much as their battles or castles, have made them immortal in history. The story of the Knights Templar was never one of unbroken triumph. For all their discipline and courage, the order was bound to the fortunes of the Crusader states, and those fortunes could rise or fall with terrifying speed. The 12th century brought both glory and disaster, and it was in these trials that the Templars' reputation as steadfast warriors of Christ was both tested and defined. No event revealed the fragility of the Crusader dream more clearly than the disaster at Hattin in 1187 and the loss of Jerusalem that followed. The Battle of Hattin came at a moment when the Crusader states were weakened by division and overconfidence. Jerusalem was ruled by King Guy of Lusignan, whose leadership was uncertain and whose decisions would prove disastrous. In contrast, his opponent, Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had united Muslim forces under his command. Charismatic, skilled, in war, and respected by friend and foe alike, Saladin represented a new and formidable threat. When Saladin's army moved into Galilee, the Crusader forces, including many Templars, set out to meet him. The Christian host marched under the burning summer sun, carrying relics such as the True Cross, believed to protect them in battle. Yet the journey was long, the soldiers were exhausted, and water was scarce. Saladin's forces harassed them, constantly, cutting them off from supplies and forcing them toward the horns of Hattin, a pair of rocky hills that offered little protection. On July 4th, 1187, the Crusader army was surrounded. Fires set by Saladin's troops choked the battlefield. With smoke, arrows rained down and the heat was unbearable. The Templars fought with their usual bravery, charging again and again, but exhaustion and thirst could not be overcome by valor alone. One by one, the lines of the Crusader knights broke. The True Cross was captured, and King Guy himself was taken prisoner. The defeat was complete. Few battles in medieval history so decisively crushed an army, and among the dead and captured were many Templars who had stood to the last. The fall of Jerusalem followed swiftly. Saladin's victory at Hattin left the holy city defenseless. In October of that same year, Jerusalem surrendered. For nearly a century, it had been the center of Crusader devotion and the home of the Templars' original mission. Its loss was a blow that shook all of Christendom. In Europe, the news spread like wildfire, inspiring grief and anger. The cry went out for a new crusade, and kings themselves answered the call. The Third Crusade brought some of the most famous rulers of Europe into the struggle. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire all took the cross. The Templars played a central role in this renewed effort, guiding armies through the unfamiliar terrain, defending supply, lines and fighting in battle. At the siege of Acre in 1191, they stood among the vanguard. At Arsuf later that year, Richard's leadership and the discipline of the knightly orders brought a rare victory against Saladin's forces. Yet despite these successes, Jerusalem itself was never regained. The city remained under Muslim control. Though access for Christian pilgrims was eventually secured, the later Crusades brought further challenges. In the Fourth Crusade, meant to reclaim Jerusalem, the armies of Christendom instead turned against Constantinople, sacking the Byzantine capital in 1204. The Templars, though less directly involved in this diversion, were caught in the wider political entanglements that weakened the unity of the Christian cause. The dream of a united front for the Holy Land gave way to rivalries, ambitions, and betrayals. As the 13th century wore on, the Templars continued to fight bravely in the defense of the Crusader states, but the tide of history was against them. One by one, the coastal cities of the Levant fell. Castles that had stood as symbols of Christian endurance were besieged and captured. The Templars were often the last to leave, holding their fortresses until hope was gone. Their stubborn defense was admired, yet it could not reverse the decline. At the same time, tensions grew between the Templars and the rulers of Europe. Monarchs respected their military skill, but grew wary of their independence and wealth. Their order answered only to the Pope, not to kings, and their financial power made them rivals as much as allies. Kings who borrowed heavily from the Templars often found their debts burdensome, and their resentment would have lasting consequences. These trials revealed the double-edged nature of the Order's success. On the battlefield, their bravery was unquestioned, but even their courage could not save Jerusalem after Hattin. In politics, their influence was immense, but it also made them targets of suspicion. Through victories and defeats, the Templars endured, but the aura of invincibility that once surrounded them was gone. Still, the disasters of the Crusades did not destroy their reputation. Chroniclers often singled out the Templars for praise, admiring how they stood firm when others fled. Their willingness to sacrifice themselves in hopeless battles became part of their legend. If the Crusader states were fragile, the Templars seemed like the iron within that fragile shell, unbending even as the world around them crumbled. By the end of the 13th century, however, the trials had taken their toll. The Holy Land was slipping away, and the Templars' purpose was shifting. Their role as warriors in the East was waning, even as their influence in Europe was growing. The stage was being set for the next act in their story, when their power at home would matter more than the battlefields of the Levant. Yet the memory of Hattin and Jerusalem lingered, a reminder of the cost of defeat and the fragile nature of dreams built on holy war. By the final decades of the 13th century, the dream of the Crusader kingdoms was fading. The castles and cities once won with such effort now stood as lonely outposts in a land that no longer belonged to them. The Muslim rulers of Egypt and Syria had grown too strong, while the Christian kingdoms of Europe had grown too divided. For the Knights Templar, who had been created to guard pilgrims and defend the Holy Land, this decline carried with it a growing sense of doom. Their mission was tied to the survival of the Crusader states, and when those states fell, their very reason for existing would be called into question. The final blow came with the siege of Acre in 1291. Acre had long been the heart of the Crusader, presence in the Levant. Its great harbour opened the way for ships from Europe, and its streets bustled with merchants, pilgrims and soldiers. It was the seat of kings and the headquarters of the Templars after the loss of Jerusalem. To lose Acre would be to lose the last jewel of Christendom in the East. The Mamluks of Egypt, fierce warriors hardened by decades of battle, laid siege to the city in the spring of 1291. Their army dwarfed the defenders, numbering in the tens of thousands, and their siege engines hurled stones and fire against Acre's walls without ceasing. Inside the city, the Templars, Hospitallers, and the remaining Knights of the West prepared to resist. They knew the odds were against them, but as always, the Templars fought with a determination that defied reason. For weeks, the defenders held out. The walls of Acre shook under the constant bombardment, and fires raged across the city. Refugees crowded the streets, pleading for ships to carry them away. The Templars held their quarter to the last, their grand fortress standing like a rock. Amid the storm, chroniclers record that they fought with desperate courage, making charge after charge even when the walls crumbled around them. But the Mamluks pressed forward with overwhelming numbers. On May 18, 1291, the final assault began. Acre fell in a storm of steel and fire. The Templars retreated into their fortress by the sea, refusing to surrender. For days they held out, even after the rest of the city was lost. When the fortress itself finally collapsed, it buried many of its defenders within. With the fall of Acre, the Crusader states came to an end. The dream of Jerusalem, once bright with holy zeal, now lay in ruins. Those who escaped the slaughter fled by sea, seeking refuge on the island of Cyprus. For the Templars, Cyprus became a new home, but it was only a shadow of what they had lost. No longer did they stand as guardians of pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, for there were no pilgrims to protect. Their castles in the east had fallen, their treasures had been abandoned, and their mission seemed to hang in the air without purpose. The order still possessed wealth, estates, and influence across Europe, yet its heart had been tied to the Holy Land. On Cyprus, the Templars attempted to regroup, dreaming of a new crusade that would retake Jerusalem. They planned expeditions and fortified the island, but no great campaign ever came. The kings of Europe were weary of crusading, their own wars at home consuming their resources and attention. The idea of retaking the Holy Land lingered as an aspiration, but the will to make it reality was gone. As the Templars adjusted to this new existence, tensions with their rivals grew sharper. The Hospitallers, who had also retreated to Cyprus, competed with them for influence and resources. Both orders had been created to serve pilgrims in Jerusalem, and now both found themselves without a clear mission. Rivalry that had once been muted in the face of shared danger now broke into open conflict. Each order sought to prove itself, the greater not only to maintain pride, but also to justify its continued existence in the eyes of Europe. For the Templars, the loss of the Holy Land struck at their identity. They had been formed to guard the Temple of Solomon and to shield pilgrims on the roads to the Holy City. Their castles, their prayers, their vows of service had all been directed toward that purpose. Without Jerusalem, without the flow of pilgrims, the heart of their mission was gone. They still trained, they still wore the white mantle marked with the red cross, and they still guarded their estates in Europe. But the holy war that had once given their lives meaning was over. This change did not go unnoticed. In the eyes of many monarchs, the Templars were now an order without a cause, a powerful brotherhood whose resources might be put to better use elsewhere. Their wealth, once seen as a blessing for the defense of the East, now appeared as a tempting prize. Their independence, once justified by their role in the Crusades, now seemed suspicious. Without the Holy Land to anchor their mission, the Templars were vulnerable to the envy and resentment of the very kings they had once served. The fall of Acre marked not only the end of the Crusader states, but also the beginning of the Templars' long decline. The battles they had fought and the castles they had defended could not preserve the dream of a Christian Jerusalem. Their withdrawal to Cyprus left them adrift, struggling to find purpose in a world that no longer needed their old one. The Holy Land had shaped them, given them their identity, and now, with its loss, the question of their future hung in the balance. In the years that followed, the Templars would continue to exist, powerful and wealthy, but the memory of Acre lingered like a shadow, It was the moment when the age of Crusader triumphs ended, and with it, the age of the Templars as defenders of pilgrims. What remained was a brotherhood rich in resources, but poor in direction, bound to face new challenges, not on the battlefields of the East, but in the courts and palaces of Europe itself. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of the Crusader states. But for the Knights Templar, it was not yet the end of their story. They still possessed vast estates across Europe, a disciplined brotherhood, and a reputation as the most formidable of the military orders. Yet without the Holy Land to defend, their purpose was increasingly questioned. To some, they seemed like a relic of another age, a brotherhood with wealth but no mission. To others, their independence and influence looked dangerous. This unease would eventually be turned against them by one of the most ambitious monarchs of the medieval world, King Philip IV of France. Philip IV, often called Philip the Fair, ruled with a cold determination. He sought to strengthen the crown's authority and to control the great institutions of his kingdom, whether they were noble families, the clergy, or independent orders like the Templars. He was also heavily indebted. The French crown had borrowed vast sums from the Templars, who by this time were not only warriors, but also expert bankers. Their network of estates, treasuries, and financial systems made them indispensable to kings, yet also resented. For Philip, who struggled with mounting expenses from wars and administration, the debts to the Templars were a heavy burden. To destroy them would be to erase his obligations and seize their wealth for himself. The king found his opportunity in the unease that already surrounded the order. The Templars were respected for their discipline, but their secrecy and power made them easy targets for suspicion. Their initiation rituals were closed to outsiders, their internal affairs hidden, and their independence from royal authority bred mistrust. Rumors began to circulate that within their secret ceremonies, the knights denied Christ, spat upon the cross, and worshipped idols. These were whispers without proof, but in a time when heresy was feared as a deadly threat to the soul, such accusations were enough to cast a dark shadow. Philip seized upon these rumors and shaped them into a weapon. He claimed that the Templars were guilty of heresy, idolatry, and corruption, presenting himself as a defender of the faith against a brotherhood that had betrayed its sacred vows. To strengthen his case, he prepared his move in secret, determined to strike suddenly before the order could defend itself. The chosen day was Friday, October 13, 1307. At dawn, royal agents swept across France in coordinated raids. Templars were seized in their preceptories, dragged from their beds, and placed under arrest. From the highest officers to humble brothers, they were taken by surprise. Their treasures and documents were seized, and their order was accused of crimes that shocked Christendom. The date itself, Friday the 13th, would forever after carry an aura of misfortune, remembered as the day of the Templars' downfall. The charges were staggering. The knights were accused of spitting on the cross during their initiation, of denying Christ, of obscene practices, and of worshipping strange idols, including a mysterious head known as Baphomet. To most who knew the Templars, such claims seemed unbelievable. Yet, under the weight of fear and suspicion, and especially under the cruelty of torture, many confessions were extracted. The methods of interrogation were harsh. Some knights, broken by pain, admitted to whatever their captors demanded. They confessed to blasphemies they had never committed, to idols they had never seen, and to practices that existed only in the minds of their accusers. Others resisted, holding fast to their innocence, even as they endured suffering. In the eyes of the crown, the confessions served their purpose. They spread the image of a brotherhood steeped in corruption, justifying Philip's actions. The scandal spread quickly. News of the arrests and confessions raced across Europe, shocking those who had once revered the Templars as holy warriors. Some rulers hesitated to follow Philip's lead, unsure of the truth of the accusations. Yet the tide of suspicion was difficult to resist. The Pope himself, Clement V, was placed in a difficult position. As head of the Church, he was meant to protect the Templars, who had been created under papal authority and sworn to the defense of Christendom. But Clement was a Frenchman, installed as Pope largely through Philip's influence, and his seat had been moved to Avignon, where the French crown held sway. Torn between duty and pressure, the Pope gradually gave way to the king's demands. Over the following months, the trials continued. More confessions were gathered, some under duress, others recanted later when the knights declared their innocence once freed from torture. Yet the damage was done. The reputation of the Templars, once shining, was now clouded by suspicion. To the public, the accusations of heresy seemed plausible precisely because the order had always lived apart, hidden in its rituals and independent in its power. Their secrecy, which had once lent them mystique, now condemned them. The road to suppression had begun. What had started as a scheme by a king desperate for wealth and power grew into a scandal that shook all of Europe. The Templars, who had stood firm on the battlefields of the East, were now powerless before the prisons and courts of their own homeland. Their bravery in war could not shield them from the machinery of politics and fear. Step by step, the order was dragged toward its ruin, its enemies determined to erase it from the world. In that fateful October morning of 1307, the future of the Knights Templar was sealed. They were no longer guardians of pilgrims or defenders of Jerusalem. They were prisoners, branded as heretics, their once proud name turned into a curse. From this moment, the brotherhood that had stood for nearly 2 centuries would move inexorably toward destruction, not by sword or siege, but by the power of intrigue, accusation, and the ambitions of a king. The dawn arrests of 1307 had shattered the Knights Templar in France, but the full weight of their destruction came slowly, through long years of imprisonment, questioning, and political maneuvering. At the heart of this process was not only King Philip IV of France, but also Pope Clement V, the head of the Church, who found himself caught between his duty to justice and the relentless pressure of the French crown. Clement V had not been Pope long when the scandal erupted. A Frenchman himself, elevated to the papacy largely through Philip's influence, he had moved the papal seat to Avignon, within easy reach of the French monarchy. From the beginning, his role in the Templars' fate was marked by hesitation and compromise. At first he resisted the king's sudden arrests, insisting that only the papacy had the authority to judge a religious order. Yet the confessions, obtained under torture, and the sheer power of Philip's campaign left Clement with little room to maneuver. In 1308, the Pope ordered an investigation of his own, summoning Templars to appear before papal commissions. Across Europe, responses varied. In some kingdoms, such as Portugal and Aragon, rulers were reluctant to follow Philip's example and remained skeptical of the charges. In England, King Edward II at first defended the order, doubting the wild accusations of heresy and blasphemy. Yet as the scandal grew and papal pressure increased, most rulers yielded, arresting Templars in their realms and allowing trials to proceed. The trials dragged on for years, marked by contradictory testimonies. Many knights repeated the confessions they had made under torture, only to retract them later and proclaim their innocence. Others held firm from the start, refusing to admit to crimes they had never committed. Still, the spectacle of an order on trial, its reputation blackened, was enough to erode much of the respect the Templars once commanded. The secrecy of their rights and their immense wealth had already bred suspicion, and now these elements were turned against them with deadly effect. The decisive moment came at the Council of Vienne in 1311 and 1312. This great gathering of bishops and clerics was called to settle the matter once and for all. The Templars hoped for a fair hearing, a chance to defend themselves openly before the church that had once been their protector. Yet Philip's presence loomed heavily over the council. His agents pressed for dissolution, arguing that even if the charges were not proven beyond doubt, the stain on the order was too great for it to continue. Pope Clement V, under immense pressure, chose the path of compromise. He declared that the order was not formally condemned for heresy, for the evidence was inconsistent, and the guilt of the Templars as a whole could not be proven. But he also declared that the reputation of the order was too damaged, its utility too diminished, and its survival too dangerous. By papal decree, the Knights Templar were dissolved in 1312. Their lands and estates were, in theory, transferred to the Hospitallers, though in practice much of their wealth was seized by local rulers, especially Philip. With the stroke of a pen, nearly 2 centuries of history were brought to an end. For the Templars imprisoned in France, the years after the council were filled with uncertainty and despair. Some were released quietly, their lives shattered but spared. Others remained behind bars, their fate determined by local inquisitors. The most fateful case was that of the order's last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. De Molay had led the Templars. During their final years, a man of advanced age but firm resolve. At first, he had confessed under torture, as so many others had, but he later retracted his words, declaring that the order was innocent and that he himself had lied only to end his suffering. His shifting testimony frustrated both the crown and the Pope, but in the end, Philip decided to make an example of him. On March 18, 1314, Jacques de Molay and several other senior Templars were brought to a platform in Paris to hear their sentences. They were to spend the rest of their lives in prison, condemned but spared death. Yet when the sentences were read, de Molay and another leader, Geoffrey de Charnay, stunned the crowd by speaking out. They proclaimed loudly that the Templars were innocent, that their order had been pure and faithful to Christ, and that all confessions against them had been lies forced by torture. Their courage left the judges shocked and enraged. Philip acted swiftly. That very evening, without further trial, Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay were led to a small island in the Seine. There, before a great crowd, they were tied to stakes and burned alive. Chroniclers record that de Molay showed no fear. As the flames rose around him, he is said to have called upon God to judge both Pope Clement and King Philip for their injustice. According to later accounts, he cursed them both, declaring that they would soon face divine punishment. The legend of this curse spread quickly. Within a year, both Clement V and Philip IV were dead. Clement succumbed to illness, and Philip died, suddenly while hunting. To many, it seemed as though the last words of the Grand Master had been answered from heaven. Whether legend or truth, the story of de Molay's curse became part of the enduring mystique of the Templars, a final act of defiance that gave their end the weight of tragedy and prophecy. Thus the order of the Knights Templar came to an end, not on the battlefields of the Holy Land where they had won their fame, but in the prisons and pyres of France. They had been warriors of God, guardians of pilgrims, and builders of castles. They had also been bankers, landowners, and rivals of kings. In the end, their power made them enemies too great to withstand. Their dissolution left behind questions, legends, and mysteries that would echo across the centuries. The trial and death of Jacques de Molay closed one chapter of medieval history, but opened another in the imagination of generations to come. The Templars' fall was both a tragedy of politics and an enduring myth, a story of faith, betrayal, and fire that would never truly be forgotten. When the flames consumed Jacques de Molay on that island in the Seine in 1314, it seemed that the story of the Knights Templar had come to its close. Their order was dissolved, their leaders executed or imprisoned, and their name disgraced by accusations of heresy. Yet in truth, the end was only the beginning of a different kind of life for the Templars. Their warriors no longer rode across the battlefields of the Holy Land, but their memory, their legends, and the mystery of their fall endured for centuries. Few groups in history have left behind such a powerful legacy, one that straddles the line between fact and myth. The immediate fate of their lands and wealth varied from place to place. By papal decree, much of their property was transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, their great rivals in the Crusades, who had managed to survive the shifting fortunes of the era. Castles, farms, vineyards, and treasuries, once held by the Templars, were now under new masters. Yet in practice, kings and nobles often seized the assets for themselves, claiming them as spoils. Philippe III of France, the architect of their destruction, made sure that much of the Order's fortune in his realm ended up in royal hands. Elsewhere, rulers dragged their feet in transferring lands to the Hospitallers, using the opportunity to enrich themselves. The surviving members of the Order faced uncertain futures. Some Templars were absorbed into the Hospitallers, particularly in regions where sympathy for the Brotherhood lingered. Others returned quietly to secular life, stripped of their vows and scattered among the towns and villages of Europe. A few were pardoned and allowed to live out their days in obscurity, while others remained imprisoned until their deaths. Although the Order as an institution was destroyed, fragments of its people endured, carrying with them memories of their vows, their battles, and their downfall. The Hospitallers inherited much of the practical role that the Templars had once played, continuing as a great military order of Christendom. Yet even as the Hospitallers built their reputation as defenders of Rhodes and later Malta, the shadow of the Templars lingered. The manner of their suppression, sudden and ruthless, made them a cautionary tale of what happened when an order grew too wealthy and too independent of kings. For monarchs and church leaders alike, the Templars became a memory of power that had slipped outside their grasp, only to be reclaimed with blood and fire. But the legacy of the Templars was not only practical. In the centuries that followed, their name took on a life of its own, becoming a canvas for legend. Chroniclers and storytellers began to associate them with relics of immense power. Some claimed they had once guarded the true cross, the Ark of the Covenant, or other treasures brought from the East. Others spun tales of a deeper mystery, tying them to the Holy Grail itself. The idea that the Templars had been more than warriors and bankers, that they had been guardians of hidden knowledge or sacred objects, spread across Europe. This association with secrecy was fueled by their very real reputation for closed rituals and private brotherhood. Few outside the Order knew what occurred in Templar initiation ceremonies, and this silence left room for the imagination to flourish. As the centuries passed, the Templars became linked to myths of hidden societies and secret guardianship. In the early modern period, the rise of Freemasonry brought a new layer to the legend. Some Masonic traditions claimed a connection to the Templars, suggesting that surviving members had gone underground and passed on their secrets through symbolic brotherhoods. While historians find little evidence for such a direct link, the idea took root, blending the Templars into the fabric of esoteric tradition. By the time of the Enlightenment and the Romantic era, the Templars were no longer remembered simply as knights who fought in the Crusades. They had become characters of mystery, woven into novels, ballads, and art. Writers depicted them as keepers of forbidden wisdom, protectors of lost treasures, or martyrs to corruption and greed. In the modern age, this fascination only deepened. The Templars appear in countless books, films, and theories, often far removed from the historical brotherhood. To this day, people speculate that the Templars hid vast treasures, that they sailed to distant lands such as Scotland or even the Americas, and that their secret survives in hidden vaults or clandestine societies. History and legend blur when the Templars are remembered, On one hand, they were very real men, living under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, who fought bravely in the wars of the Crusades and managed estates with extraordinary skill. On the other hand, they have become symbols of the mysterious and the forbidden, figures who belong as much to myth as to fact. The truth of their lives is compelling enough, yet the stories layered upon them have given them a second life that has outlasted their actual order by centuries. Their lasting power lies in this combination of reality and myth. They embody the grandeur and tragedy of the Crusades, the dangers of wealth and independence in a world ruled by ambitious kings, and the eternal human fascination with secrets. Their red cross on a white mantle remains one of the most recognizable symbols of medieval knighthood, while their name carries a resonance that stirs curiosity even in those who know little of their history. In the end, the Knights Templar were not eternal in flesh and blood, but they became eternal in memory. Their castles may have crumbled and their order may have been extinguished, yet their story was never buried. Instead, it passed into legend, growing larger with every retelling. Whether remembered as warriors of God, as bankers of kings, as seekers of the Grail, or as founders of secret societies, they continue to stand at the crossroads of history and myth. The legacy of the Templars is a reminder of how power, faith, and mystery can shape the imagination of generations. They began as humble knights sworn to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. They ended as martyrs consumed by fire and suspicion. Yet in memory, they live on, not merely as a brotherhood of the past, but as a symbol of the eternal search for truth and the mysteries hidden beneath the surface of history.